Welcome, everyone. Good morning. We've arranged another spectacular Wednesday morning for you, weather-wise, as well as a stimulating lecture. I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague on the Planning Committee, John Ferries, who's going to introduce the speaker. But before I do that, just let me remind you to submit your cards with the questions at the break. We have extra ones if you need them. And also, I think you know, but I'll remind you that these sessions are being taped, and the tapes are available from CATV for sale. There's a desk out there where you can purchase the lectures for each of the weeks. I also have to, before I turn it over to John, thank our very generous supporters, corporate sponsors, Ledyard, Caldwell Law, and Kendall. Got it. We also have Wells Fargo and a new one this morning, and that is the Hypertherm Hope Foundation. So now over to John Ferries. John.
Thanks, Tom. Good morning. This is going to be a very special session of the summer lecture series for several reasons. The first is that there are a number of people who have come here to share this moment with Scott, who I would like now to welcome, but it's very rare that we have this kind of group of people coming. We usually have a speaker by him or herself. But I'd like to introduce Scott's welcome his three daughters, Anna, Robin, and Eliza, who are in the front row here, who have come with him from California. They've come from California to see their dad in action and also to take a peek at what might become a career college choice called Dartmouth. They also toured the Thayer School. I want to welcome Scott's parents, David and Kathy Sandell, who have come from Cape Cod to be here as well. And Scott was on the crew at Dartmouth and a very important member of it. And therefore, I have the opportunity to welcome his crew coach at Dartmouth, Whit Mitchell, right down here. And I also have the opportunity to welcome a person who was Scott's roommate and fellow crew member at Dartmouth, Sam Kinney, and his wife, Winnie. Sam Kinney. There are other friends of, I said this is special. This is a love fest. There are other friends of Scott's who are here too. Bev Carter, Jamie Hardig, Elliot Thompson, and others. They've all come to share this moment. And I also want to welcome the Dean of the Thayer School of Engineering, Joe Helbley, who's sitting here in the front. And there are in our audience 4 professors from the Thayer School who are here, and each in their own way have courses that are connected to either entrepreneurship or innovation, and so we're really happy to have them be part of it. Now, I mentioned that this is special for another reason, and that is that Whit Mitchell, who is the crew coach, has written a book, and the book is entitled Working in Sync. Here's a copy of it. You see the cover there, and it's an amazing book about a bunch of young men at Dartmouth who were learning to row together in unison and compete at a high level, but who were asked to reflect on that experience and what kind of life lessons and leadership lessons they learned from it. And in this book, each has a chapter. Scott has a chapter, Sam Kinney has a chapter, and they relate how the experience of working on a team that is as close-knit as a crew needs to be, how that carried over into their career. The reason I bring this up is that Whit has brought with him 50 copies of this book. And these are free to those of you who would like a copy. So this is the generosity of Whit Mitchell. So what we're going to do is we're going to in order not to have a stampede at the break, we're going to have which will be Tom Blinkhorn, will stand up with some cards. They're colored cards. And all you have to do, if you would like a copy, it's signed by Scott as well. You can just put your name on it, and that's at the break. And then we'll have a little lottery in the back, and then we'll announce when we start the Q&A who the 50 people are who can pick up their books after the Q&A is over in the back of the room at one of those tables. Now, I'd like to introduce Scott. You've read about his many accomplishments in all the material that's been printed and online at OSHER, and there are many. And he's been associated with a lot of interesting startup companies and with great success. He is managing general partner of New Enterprise Associates, a gigantic venture capital firm in the world, and he personally leads their investment practices in emerging companies and technologies in information technology and alternative energy. And he leads their investment practices in a big emerging country called China. Now, he's been recognized by his peers and by the media who cover business in many wonderful ways for his accomplishments. But what I would like to finish the introduction with is to quote Scott himself into what it's like operating in a venture capital business. And you'll see and hear, it's not easy, but this is what he does. Venture capital investing is a very risky business. Investment decisions are made with little information and tremendous uncertainty. They are commitments that last almost a decade on average and are usually made in a few weeks or months, sometimes in a single day. Analysis only gets you so far. At the end of the day, you have to trust your instincts, and the best investments are often the least obvious because they're brand new inventions that don't compare to anything. They have no market by definition. We like to say we invest in huge markets that don't exist yet, and they often involve unproven entrepreneurs who have not yet shown that their invention will even work. I'd like to bring forth now Scott Sandell.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here, especially my family, wherever they are, and Whit and Sam. Where's Sam? And Sam Kinney, somewhere here? Anyway, we're here to have a little conversation about the state of America's innovative power in the world. I want to start with what I see every day as a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley and tell you a little bit about our investing practice. We invest much of our capital in the United States, but increasingly across the world in things like medical devices, biotechnology, semiconductors, software, and the internet, broadly defined. We also have operations in India and China. I'll discuss the state of innovation today and America's relative position. But then I want to take you back to America's innovative roots and share the often untold story of how Silicon Valley came to be what it is today. This is important to understand because most of what we have today is the result of policies, investments, and practices that took shape decades ago and which are rapidly being copied by other nations like China. We'll discuss China in particular and other global factors which are creating both challenge and opportunity for the competitiveness of our innovation ecosystem. And we'll look at the policies, investments, and practices that are vital to the future of our innovation ecosystem. Of course, I wouldn't be earning my keep without a few predictions of my own and Dartmouth's potential role in it. Where do we have the click? Oh, here we go. Excuse me. Few would challenge the notion that Silicon Valley is the epicenter of innovation in the world today. Not only is this view held here in the United States, but it's so widely held that governments and corporations come from around the world to Silicon Valley every day trying to learn its magic so that they can create their own goose that lays golden eggs. Many of these even have names that pay homage to Silicon Valley. Israel has Silicon Wadi, Cambridge, England, Silicon Fen. Closer to home, New York has Silicon Alley. Most of these places are so convinced that Silicon Valley is the almighty temple of innovation that they also establish offices there. It seems like every global corporation has one, from Siemens and BMW to IBM and General Motors, even to Alibaba and Baidu. Governments too. They all come to our offices thinking we're a gateway to the Valley, so this is very much firsthand what I see every day. Lest you think I take this for granted, I saw this very same pattern of behavior in the late 90s, and it all went up in smoke just about the time that Dartmouth's entering class were learning to crawl. Judging by the gray hair here in the audience, though, most of you will remember that the internet became a worldwide sensation almost 20 years ago today. It was August 9th, 1995, when stock in the 16-month-old unprofitable company Netscape went public and doubled in value in the first day, fetching a valuation of about $3 billion. Why? Well, Netscape had, of course, invented one of the earliest internet browsers, that piece of software that allows users to navigate the fledgling World Wide Web. Almost overnight, people proclaimed that the internet would change everything, and hordes of entrepreneurs flocked to Silicon Valley to start companies that would use the internet for everything from reading a newspaper to buying groceries or shoes online. Many of these companies in turn went public, even before they had significant revenues. The coin of the realm then was not revenue, but eyeballs, as one naysayer after another capitulated to the hysteria and bought in. The market skyrocketed until, of course, March 2000 when it crashed. This latest tulip mania crashed so hard that the NASDAQ plummeted 80% in 2 years. Silicon Valley was dead, or so it seemed. Eyeballs did not pay bills, and in my Menlo Park neighborhood, 25% of the homes were up for sale. It was a really hard time for many people. Most of those thought that the internet might just be judged by history as a novelty. As it turns out, that judgment was somewhat premature. Yes, most of the early internet companies did perish, but some survived, and they've created tremendous wealth. The top 15 alone are worth $3.1 trillion today, which is about 4% of all publicly traded assets globally. These are not only Silicon Valley companies like Google and Facebook, but Chinese giants like Baidu and Alibaba. You might recall that Alibaba went public last year, and it was the largest IPO in stock market history at the time. Now, this might seem incomprehensible from the outside looking in, but it's actually quite clear what happened and why. The problem with the internet in the late 90s was that it was underpowered and there were too few people connected to it, using browsers that were very limited. Nevertheless, its appeal was universal, and gradually it improved, and the number of people connected to it skyrocketed in the first decade of the new millennium. We'll discuss this more in a minute, but first let's address the question I know you all have. Are we in a bubble again? Boom or bubble? Personally, I think Mark Benioff, founder of Salesforce.com and NEA portfolio company, has the right take. It's not a tech bubble. It's the biggest wave of innovation in the history of the world. That doesn't mean that some companies aren't overvalued relative to their current business. It refers more to the fundamentals of those companies and their ability to grow rapidly and ultimately profitably based on fundamental innovation, technical, and in terms of business models. Let's look under the hood to see what I mean. The key to understanding why this time is different is understanding the power of the cloud combined with smartphones. Together, these technologies are redefining enterprise computing architectures, putting trillions of dollars of market cap up for grabs, opening up even more opportunity for online businesses to flourish, and ultimately changing the physics of almost every business. Now, that's a lot to swallow in one sentence, so let me explain. You all understand smartphones, those computers that you have in your hand, which are sort of the equivalent of a mainframe about 20 years ago. And you know they can connect to virtually unlimited capabilities through your mobile carrier, like Verizon or AT&T. Those carriers are, of course, connected to the internet, which in turn is connected to data centers, which contain huge numbers of PCs, virtually unlimited data storage, and super fast networking gear to ensure that everything you want in your hands you get in milliseconds. Now, you might still be a little foggy about the cloud, which is okay because clouds are basically made of fog, but the cloud that I'm talking about is really the PCs, the storage, and the networking gear that your smartphone can call on anytime, anywhere. That computing cloud is growing extremely fast as users like you want to do more and more things with your phones. And because demand is growing so fast, costs are coming down really, really fast too, which makes it possible to do more and more things cheaply and easily. This is a very powerful virtuous cycle. As demand for computing grows, supply grows, and costs plummet, enabling more and more capabilities to be affordable. Hopefully the cloud's not quite as foggy as it was a minute ago. But let me spend a minute tying it into the computing revolution of the last 50 years. In the beginning, there were single computers connected to dumb terminals which issued commands to them. These grew up and became very powerful and were called mainframes. IBM was the big winner in that arms race, and importantly, the architecture of the mainframe required solving many fundamental computer science problems, so that the same ideas could be borrowed from and built on in later computer architectures. As luck would have it, IBM invented the IBM PC in 1981, but eventually lost what would become known as the client-server revolution. Now, with names like that, it's no wonder not many people outside the tech world paid any attention to this stuff. Nevertheless, a whole bunch of new companies emerged to make all the pieces of the client-server world, from microprocessors to applications, names like Intel, Microsoft, and Oracle. IBM eventually sold the PC business to Lenovo, a Chinese maker. But before that, the internet got underway. What's important to understand about this sequence is that each new computing architecture borrowed from the last one, but the winners were never the same from one generation to the next, with few exceptions. And the internet we have today, which was too underpowered in the late 90s, is now so powerful and ubiquitous that computing is almost free, available anywhere, anytime through your smartphone. You can issue simple commands using simple apps on your phone, which cause tremendous computing power to be summoned to perform whatever tasks you wish. Many of these are offered for free in order to entice you to use their products so they can advertise to you, or to get you to pay for something else that they might offer you within the smartphone applications. One of our portfolio companies, Duolingo, goes one step farther. They offer you a way to learn a foreign language. And as you are learning the foreign language, you're actually doing translation services, which they can sell. How they do that is the subject of a different lecture. Hopefully you can see that the combination of the cloud plus the mobile smartphone has a lot of possibility. When I said that computing, storage, and networking gear were becoming cheaper as the internet cloud grows, I wasn't kidding. This is really fundamental to understanding why this time is different. On this chart, you can get a sense of it. These are all logarithmic charts, so a straight line signifies exponential improvement. To quantify the change in the cost of computing, for example, the same penny buys today about 10,000 times as much processing power as it did in 2000. And this computing power is connected at higher speeds to 100 times more people than there were in 2000 connected to the internet. Here you can see a connectivity heat map starting in about 1990. In other words, how many people were connected to the internet. That's 1995, 2000, 2010, 2014. That's 2020. Now, increasingly, traffic is mobile. And mobile traffic is skyrocketing. In just 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, it's expected to increase 13-fold. Part of the rapid rise in the consumption of computing is smart devices. In other words, it's not just people issuing commands through their smartphones to all these computers in the cloud, but computers acting on their behalf. These are so-called smart devices, and they're catching on quickly. Here you can see that 35% of Americans already own one. I'm talking about things like Apple's new iWatch, in-car navigation systems that check on traffic up ahead, smart TVs that notice what you like to watch and record it for you, and so forth. There are already more smartphones than people on the planet, but now people have smart devices summoning the computers in the internet cloud to help them. No wonder, then, that the internet cloud has gone from $5 billion in 2008 to almost $100 billion today. Corporations have adopted this architecture for their own data centers too, because it's cheaper and more powerful than their client-server systems, and that's called the private cloud. That's estimated to be about $500 billion today. About now, you might be thinking that you're in the wrong lecture. You came here to hear about innovation, not computer architecture, but understanding the architecture of the modern internet and all the devices connected to it will help you understand how the internet is on the verge of changing everything, or changing every business that's not already been changed. The first phase of the internet, the one that created the 15 companies that are worth $3.1 trillion today, was primarily about what you do online. You search for information. That's Yahoo, Google, and Baidu in China. You buy things and have them sent to you. That's Amazon, eBay, and Alibaba in China. And you can communicate with your friends more easily. That's Facebook, Twitter, and Tencent in China. But the capabilities that those companies created to enable their businesses online are powerful for offline businesses too. The ability to target very specific users based on their interests online can help offline businesses find new customers more cheaply. Tools that keep customers in touch with companies for customer support or order tracking help offline businesses too. As more and more interactions with customers happen through mobile devices, companies have more information to analyze to understand the next things they should make for their customers. The fact that computing is nearly free helps all businesses get online more cheaply, and many existing internet businesses help other businesses grow. In short, the basic building blocks of almost every business are being enhanced by the technologies of the online world. I'm calling that the physics of business because it changes the laws that apply. It costs less to start a business than it used to. It costs less to acquire new customers, to service them, to ship to them, and to create technology for them. The result is that every week we meet an entrepreneur who started a business that could disrupt sectors that until today have seen little innovation in a long time. In case you're struggling to think of one, how about Uber or Airbnb? Had anything fundamentally changed in the taxi business in the last 100 years? Or the hospitality industry? And in the case of Uber, it's not just the taxi industry that's in for change. Consider that in San Francisco, it costs less today to take an Uber X 3.5 times a day than it does to own a Toyota Camry. Some predict we might need 80% fewer cars in the future as more and more people skip car ownership altogether. That sounds great for Uber drivers, until you hear futurists talk about self-driving cars, eliminating 12 million jobs for drivers in America. I remember being really eager to learn to drive. It was freedom. But my twin daughters here turned 16 in early July, and they are just now starting to work on getting their driver's licenses. What they have been more eager to do, however, is use Uber. Uber and Airbnb are pretty well known. Let me spend a minute or two telling you about some other businesses that are going to see serious change. How about the mattress industry? You saw that one coming? No. Or maybe you think I'm kidding. The company's called Casper. It consists of a few Stanford engineers who thought they could make a better mattress. Instead of going to work for one of a handful of the companies left in the old, tired mattress industry, they asked themselves the question, why not just start a company and sell direct to consumers? Sure, they knew they could make a better mattress. They also knew they could market it online, take orders online, have the mattresses shipped directly to the consumers, and scale a business with very little capital because the underlying physics have changed. We invested $5 million a year ago, and today they're on track to ship more than $100 million of mattresses, profitably. The mattresses are better and cheaper, and the physics of their business is much better. Did I mention they only started this company 3 years ago? How about one a little closer to home? Higher education. Dartmouth is an edX partner, but there's an alternative MOOC, which is a massively open online course platform called Coursera, which I would posit is even better. Now, I'm a little biased because it started in my living room, at least as a company. It was a Stanford project only 3 years ago when 2 faculty members put 2 classes online and opened them to the world. 200,000 students came with no advertising and hardly a nickel spent. They took the very same class that the Stanford students were taking for free. While they didn't get Stanford credit for taking the classes, they tested almost as well as the Stanford students, and they never had to show up on campus. 70% of them were from outside the United States, so they never even had to come to this country to get access to our great education. Keep that in mind when we want to talk a little bit later about immigration policy. Many faculty and universities are threatened by edX and Coursera and other educational technologies which they think could make them obsolete. I don't think so. But if it makes you feel any better, a young Dartmouth alum, a few years younger than me, Naval Ravikant, class of '95, has started something called AngelList, which aims to automate venture capitalists. It's going pretty well. The point is that the technology you now understand, this internet cloud thing, and that device in your hands, the smartphone, are changing everything. And that is not going to stop because the cat is out of the bag. I don't know yet if all the mice know it. Now, I would be remiss, I've probably missed a few slides here. Let's make sure we catch up. Yes, here we go. I would be remiss, and my Dartmouth classmate Dave Mott would be upset if I didn't talk a little bit about what's happening in medicine. Dave runs our medical practice, which is one of the largest investing practices in medicine in venture capital. And that world is changing almost every bit as much as the technology business. It's partly driven by the application of computing to medicine, as evidenced by this headline here between announcing this collaboration between Google and Johnson & Johnson. But the bigger difference here has to do with science. We now know about disease at the molecular level, and the genetic propensities which create it are breathtaking. Cancer used to be diagnosed by where it occurred, lung cancer, prostate cancer, and so on. But now we identify genes that cause a given type of cancer, and we can personalize treatments based on a person's DNA and use much more targeted therapies, which makes it more likely that we find one that works. Not unlike the internet, study of the human genome has had its own phoenix rising experience. The human genome was first sequenced with great fanfare in 2000, but it cost $100 million a person to do back then. The project seemingly languished for a decade, and many wrote it off. But today it costs less than $1,000 to sequence your human genome, and we understand much more about genomics. But to learn more about that, you have to invite Dave Mott up here to give you a talk. I would highly encourage you to do that since he's at the forefront of it, and his daughter Molly is in the class of 2018, so he's here regularly anyway. In fact, I was here in the spring for a Thayer meeting, and as the practice is at the Hanover Inn, they put your name on the board when you're in residence, and I guess they had done that, and I got a call on my cell phone. It was from Dave Mott, and he said, "Hey, Scott, what are you doing in Hanover?" And I was trying for my life to figure out how he knew that I was in Hanover, but he was here for the freshman parents' weekend or something. Anyway, it was nice to see him. Before I leave medicine, I want to point out one more thing, which is that the physics of medicine is changing too. Of course, I don't mean that literally, for all you physics geeks who will proclaim that physics is foundational to all life science disciplines, and it is. But what I'm saying is that the laws which have governed drug discovery and development are changing so much that I like to say the physics have changed there too. I can see you cringing, but it makes an important point. It costs less money and takes less time today to make new drugs, and the drugs are more effective and safer. And it's an important part of the equation when we're talking about the future of American innovation. Not surprisingly, the success of American innovation has created a lot of envy around the world, and that's led to others trying to copy our success. I already mentioned the delegations from corporations and governments that come to Silicon Valley every day, but I didn't tell you that this has been happening for a really long time. Deng Xiaoping, the great leader of China after Mao Zedong, who declared that a black mouse and a white mouse were equally good if they could both get the cheese, thereby sanctioning free markets in the communist system, sent the 2,000 best students in the country to the United States in 1982. Each was given a different field to study so as to bring that knowledge back to China. I've been to China 40 times or so, and I learned about this on one of my first trips. I was an invited speaker to the annual Chinese Venture Capital Convention in 2003. I arrived expecting there to be a few venture capitalists sitting around the table, but instead I found there were already 800 attendees at China's big VC powwow. That was 2003. And today there are far more attendees, far more events, and a lot more capital. China invested $17 billion in the venture industry last year, up from $1 billion in 2003. Now, we still invested 3 times more than that, but a dollar there goes a lot farther than a dollar here. While China is very determined to become the leader in innovation and has made tremendous progress since 2003, other nations around the world are trying too. We may remain strong from an innovation standpoint here in America, but we will no longer be dominant, no matter what we do. The cat is out of the bag, and red and black mice are running everywhere. Like China has been doing for many years, these countries are studying the US, trying to figure out what makes our innovation engine roar. Which begs the question, can American-style innovation be replicated? What does that even mean? As this timeline, which is a little bit selective, of US history shows, the US has never suffered for a lack of ideas or ingenuity. And while Silicon Valley is the rage today, if you want to understand the history of American innovation, you of course have to come east. Our founding fathers were innovators themselves, and it doesn't take more than a kindergarten version of US history to remember Ben Franklin's bifocals, Thomas Edison's light bulb, or the Wright brothers' airplane. But it was Alexander Graham Bell's telephone and the Bell Telephone Company he founded that led to the creation of Bell Labs, a name practically synonymous with US innovation in the last century. Research conducted at Bell Labs led to 8 Nobel Prizes, including one for my partner Arno Penzias, which I'll elaborate on in a minute or two, 2 Turing Awards, and many, many significant inventions, including the transistor in 1947. The transistor is significant not only because it's a building block of almost everything electronic today, but because one of its inventors, William Shockley, left to start his own company, Shockley Semiconductor, in 1956. And he started the company in a California valley south of San Francisco, which up to that point was really famous just for peach orchards and nice summer weather for wealthy San Franciscans who wanted to get away from the foggy, cold weather in the city. William Shockley may have pioneered the semiconductor industry, the main component of which gave Silicon Valley its name, but it was Bill Hewlett and David Packard who got there first. They started Hewlett-Packard, or HP, in 1938 in this Palo Alto garage, pictured here on the left. Many people, in fact, think that that's all that's required to start a world-beating company in Silicon Valley, a garage. And if you're not convinced, the one on the right is Google, started 60 years later about 1 mile north in Menlo Park. But the reality is, it's actually a lot harder to start a company, and it takes quite a bit more than just a garage. We're going to look into what is required for innovation to thrive in a minute, but before we do, I want to fill in a little bit more of Silicon Valley history. Bill Hewlett and David Packard were encouraged to start HP by their former Stanford professor, Fred Terman. It's actually Fred who might rightfully be called the father of Silicon Valley. He played an enormous role in setting up the defense industry in Silicon Valley. He recommended the creation of the Stanford Industrial Park, where HP headquarters are today, and where Facebook was until recently. In the 1950s, he doubled Stanford's engineering school to support research funded by the military. NASA set up a research center in Sunnyvale, and the military became the biggest customers of the nascent semiconductor industry. William Shockley, incidentally, was sufficiently difficult that 8 of his protégés left Shockley Semiconductor a year after it was founded to start Fairchild Semiconductor. 2 of the so-called traitorous 8, Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, later founded Intel. Here I've listed some other great companies, not all of which are based in Silicon Valley, but what they have in common is all of them have received government funding of some kind. And in case you can't see this clearly, I'm talking about Apple, Compaq, Intel, Amgen, Google, Qualcomm, many others. It turns out it takes a lot more than a garage, especially for breakthrough technologies. Venture capitalists, incidentally, are usually there only when there's a clear value proposition and market traction. While some of us do more pioneering work, most of the money flows in later. The cycle is virtuous because one startup begets the next, just as the transistor and Shockley came out of Bell Labs, which led to Fairchild Semiconductor, which eventually led to Intel. At each step along the way, engineers and scientists were able to see the next thing because they were part of the last one. That's one reason it's hard to replicate Silicon Valley. Let's look at that virtuous cycle, the goose that lays all these golden eggs. First, it takes very talented people who are almost always well-educated. They need funding for research and later the development of products based on the breakthroughs they find in their research. Those products need to go to market. They have to get into customers' hands, which in turn inspires and enables more risk capital to feed the cycle. These four components are integral to fueling and fostering innovation, but there are many, many other forces and factors shaping our innovation ecosystem. Far too many to squeeze into one screen, although I've done my best to summarize it here. On the one side are influencing factors like policy, regulation, and spending. Things like immigration, patents, tax, and education fall under this category. And believe me, these influencing factors matter very much when it comes to how well or how much this cycle produces. And on the right are macro forces or events, a hodgepodge of things that include demographic, geopolitical, and market forces. I'll touch on more of all of this in the context of America's current and future innovation strength. Excuse me. But in any discussion of what makes Silicon Valley, there's one other thing you need to understand, and that's the culture. The Valley has a very distinct culture, which is different from the East Coast or anywhere else in the world. It starts with diversity and inclusion. It is among the most diverse metropolitan areas in the world, with 183 languages spoken in the public schools. That is extremely appealing to people of all backgrounds, especially those who have faced discrimination in their homelands. If the best of them always want to come to Silicon Valley, it's a huge advantage, and one that is particularly difficult to replicate, especially for China. You can't change people's attitudes by fiat. And diverse teams tend to be more creative, another bonus. Silicon Valley also embraces failure, which promotes aggressive risk-taking. You need look no further than the term sheet that an East Coast venture capitalist offers compared to that of a West Coast venture capitalist to see that the East Coast is much more conservative. Great things happen here, too, don't get me wrong. But the proportion of venture capital that flows through Silicon Valley is now more than 40% of the national total. Even highly successful East Coast startups often move west, like Facebook did. We see it in our portfolio time and again. When they get traction, they head west. There is simply a critical mass in Silicon Valley that would be very hard to replicate. Much of the best talent because it's a meritocracy, much of the venture capital because it's easier to assemble what you need, lawyers, partners, many other things. They're often right next door or across the street. Because of that, things happen faster. Not as fast as China in my experience, but faster than anywhere else in the US. And speed to market is a huge advantage for most startups. I remember when I was at Stanford Business School, someone hung up an obnoxious poster that said, "The future is so bright I have to wear shades." Looking back on the last 23 years since I graduated from the GSB, I would say it's been an incredible experience and I wouldn't trade it for anything. But when I look ahead, as bright as the future looks in front of me, I worry that the roots of our success are not being fed. Silicon Valley is a historical accident that has been created by many people and companies, has benefited from some wise government policies, from tremendous defense spending on research and as a customer for new technology. But the roots are not being fed the way they used to be. Here's a question for you. Which of these periods was the most technologically progressive era in US economic history? The answer? As observed by economist Alexander Field, is 1929 to 1941. Kind of interesting. The most striking aspect of Field's argument as it relates to today is his assertion that the progress in invention and innovation during the 1930s is what fueled the US's remarkable economic performance before and during World War II and laid the foundation for the prosperity of the 50s and 60s. I highlight this point to underscore the idea that we reap what we sow. At the height of the Great Depression, we were laying the groundwork for decades of prosperity. What groundwork are we laying today? Here you can see US R&D funding as a percent of GDP. It's up 4% in the last 13 years, but China's more than doubled R&D in the same period. It's catching up quickly. In absolute dollar terms, we're still ahead. But as recently as 2011, we equaled the next 7 countries combined. Now we have to add France to our title to match Japan and China. But the most troubling statistics are these. Only 16% of research and development investment goes to basic research. Vannevar Bush distinguished between basic research, or research performed without thought of practical ends and resulting in general knowledge and an understanding of nature and its laws, and applied research. He cautioned that the further progress of industrial development would stagnate if basic research were long neglected. Vannevar Bush was, of course, the head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development during World War II and the founder of Raytheon. The path to innovation is almost never a straight line, as evidenced by some of these unlikely or accidental paths to scientific progress. Accidental discoveries account for some of the world's most influential and fundamental innovation. Penicillin was the result of accidental mold contamination of flu cultures. And there are countless examples of basic research projects that sound frankly ridiculous. Take rat massage, for example. Why would anyone want to massage a rat? However, this research yielded some very important learnings about tactile stimulation, leading to better care for premature infants. Related savings are estimated at more than $10,000 per infant, resulting in annual healthcare savings in this country of $4.7 billion. Infant care was also improved as a result of the improbably titled study, Acoustic Trauma in Guinea Pigs, leading to a new treatment for infant hearing loss. People were outraged that $250,000 in government funding were spent studying the sex life of screwworms. Yet this basic research ultimately saved the U.S. cattle industry over $20 billion. And research in the molecular structure of jellyfish led to a stunning breakthrough and a Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2008. The gene that makes a jellyfish glow is having a revolutionary impact on medical and biological science, enabling researchers to track proteins inside living cells. Imagine how the ability to see cancer cells or viruses multiply and spread transforms our understanding of disease. So basic research is fundamental to innovation. In the tech world, Google is one of my favorite examples. Founders Sergey Brin and Larry Page were both fellows at the National Science Foundation when they invented the search algorithm that spawned Google. Essentially, today we have Google because two scientists were intrigued by a mathematical challenge. But it's a lot of expense and a lot of risk. It's a tough job for corporations to convince shareholders of the benefits when those benefits are 10 to 15 years down the road or more. The government, too, faces public backlash over many of the basic research programs that receive federal funding. Bottom line, there's been a weakening in the U.S. appetite for fundamental research. It didn't used to be this way. Earlier, I talked about Bell Labs as part of a broader ecosystem of innovation at work. Bell Labs wasn't the only corporate lab, but it was among the most prolific, and it's a great example of some of the important basic research done in the United States throughout much of the last century. The transistor example I gave earlier is one among many. The man shown in the foreground of this picture is Arno Penzias. Today he's a partner at my firm, but in 1978 he was the recipient of the Nobel Prize in Physics for the discovery of cosmic microwave background radiation, that is, the oldest light in the universe, created by thermal radiation left over from the Big Bang. Arno's a brilliant physicist, but when he and another scientist made their discovery in 1964, they weren't looking to prove the Big Bang theory. They were working on antenna receiver systems for radio astronomy observations and encountered radio noise they couldn't explain. They ruled out a variety of possibilities, including radiation from the Milky Way, noise from the nearby New York City, or even vibrations caused by pigeon droppings, before arriving at the theory that the noise was the background radiation predicted by some cosmological theories. And they wound up collaborating with a third physicist at Princeton before they got there. So this work that allowed astronomers to confirm the Big Bang theory was a happy accident, enabled by the capacity for basic research, the value placed on experimentation, and the ability to collaborate across the ecosystem. Another corporate R&D hub, Xerox PARC, made extraordinary advances in computer science and information technology hardware. Its contributions include the modern personal computer, the graphical user interface, and laser printing, among many others. In the days when the U.S. accounted for more than half of global research, much of it was fueled by these R&D hubs like Bell Labs and Xerox PARC, and research conducted at academic facilities around the country. Yet, those labs are largely disappearing, or have disappeared. Bell Labs wound up a division of Alcatel-Lucent, which announced in 2008 that it was pulling out of basic science altogether and would focus on more immediately marketable areas. Park still exists as an independent company after being spun out of Xerox, but it's safe to say its best days are behind it. We actually looked at it as an investment when they spun out and concluded we couldn't make an attractive return, at least not in a reasonable time frame. And the basic research conducted within U.S. universities and colleges is very much under threat. The steady erosion of R&D hubs is not the only gap in this ecosystem. We're also facing a growing shortage of scientists to do the research. In 1980, 23% of NIH grants were awarded to scientists under the age of 35. By 2002, that number was just 4%, and in 2006, there were more grant recipients over the age of 70 than there were under the age of 30. A look at higher education and secondary education suggests that's just the tip of the iceberg. For many decades, the U.S. had the lion's share of global PhDs, but today we award fewer than 15%, trailing Asia. Similar to the R&D expenditures discussed earlier, it's not that the U.S. is awarding fewer doctorates, but growth is slower, just as other nations are accelerating. Speaking of other nations, our secondary education system is the pipeline for tomorrow's generation of researchers and scientists, entrepreneurs, and executives. And that is something we should all be worried about. We hear plenty about the U.S.'s lackluster performance versus international peers, particularly in science and math. The most recent assessment ranks the U.S. 36th, far behind many nations, most notably China's first place. Education is something I spend a lot of time thinking about. My father and mother were educators. My wife is an educator. I have school-aged children, and I'm an investor in several education technology companies. When it comes to our secondary education system, there are things that I find even more concerning than our ranking versus global peers. The U.S. has never been at the top of the global heap when it came to science and math testing. Rote learning has never been our way, and I don't think it's our key to future innovation. STEM is important, but not so we can demonstrate that we know as much as other people. It's important as part of a curriculum that encourages creativity, curiosity, problem solving, and critical thinking. A curriculum that leaves room for experimentation, for exploration, and for failure. These are the qualities that truly differentiate us in our drive and our ability to innovate, and they're far more important than our pecking order on a standardized test. And if you don't believe me, just ask the Chinese. As this chart shows, Chinese and American parents have drastically different perspectives of what skills their children will need to thrive and drive innovation. 52% of American parents believe that math and computer science are the most critical, but only 9% of Chinese parents agree. By contrast, Chinese parents were twice as likely as their American counterparts to cite creative approaches to problem solving and entrepreneurial and business skills as critical to driving innovation. An educational system that works is fundamental to our innovation pipeline, but setting out to fix what's broken is only part of the answer. We must also cultivate more than ever the things we get right. For many years, despite its flaws, one could argue that the patent system is something that we got largely right. Patents support $5 trillion of economic output in the United States. That's about a third of GDP, and 40 million American jobs. And patents aren't only about protecting intellectual property. They're also about disclosing the inventor's contribution to the knowledge pool, which paves the way for collaboration for others to build on that work. Without a patent system that works, the risk-reward balance is no longer attractive to outside investors. Unfortunately, that system is struggling today for several important reasons. One is related to patent activity. More patents were filed in 2014 than any year in human history, but the quality is a growing cause for concern. An important related metric, the volume of published scientific material, dropped 23% between 2013 and 2014. The number of citations has declined as well. There has been some patent legislation on the table for many months that has quite literally kept me up at night. Although it appears, thankfully, that Congress won't be taking action on these bills for a few months, the proposed legislation is deeply troubling because it will have the unintended consequence of making it very difficult for small companies to defend their intellectual property. And if the U.S. companies can't protect their intellectual property, it will stunt our innovation potential. This is one example of policy that has a very direct and significant impact on the U.S.'s ability to innovate. Another is immigration. Without immigrants, there would be no Silicon Valley as we know it. This is true in the most literal sense. 3 of the traitorous 8 were foreign-born, but the reality is much more extensive. By 2000, 53% of the Valley's science and engineering workforce was foreign-born. This was the result of a decades-long surge in immigration beginning in 1965, when the quota system was abolished in favor of a new policy designed to attract skilled labor to the United States. Wow, was that ever successful? And those foreign workers sought out Silicon Valley more than any other part of the country. It would be almost impossible to overstate the impact of this influx of talent, both for the region and for the U.S. as a whole. They came to study, they came to work, and they stayed. And they started companies in numbers far exceeding their U.S.-born counterparts. Immigrant founders started 52% of new Silicon Valley companies between 1995 and 2005. Across the U.S., they make up about 13% of the population, but they start more than 25% of businesses, while native-born startups have dropped to a 30-year low. Yet, in a dangerous about-face, today we are more likely to educate them and send them back to their country. Security concerns related to 9/11 and the rise of China have led the U.S. to increasingly tighter regulations on foreign students and scientists wishing to work in the U.S. This means that rather than starting companies here, they're going back to their own countries and starting businesses there. And while American universities have long been a key attractor of foreign talent, that too could wane with the rapid rise of online learning. I mentioned Coursera and edX earlier. Companies like these are making it possible for anyone anywhere in the world to get a world-class education. If we make it hard to get in, we run the risk they'll simply stay home. And as we erect barriers to foreign workers entering the U.S., many American companies are simply following the talent. U.S. companies are moving R&D offshore. The percent of U.S. multinational corporation R&D workers based abroad has doubled in just the last 5 years to almost a third. Immigration policy is a huge contributing factor, but there are many policies related to tax and regulation that just aren't conducive to innovation and economic growth. I won't make a laundry list here, but we'll point out a few examples that have created great friction in my line of work. One is the incredible hurdles companies face in bringing new medical devices and drugs to patients. There's been some progress in the last couple of years, but not nearly enough. The process for new drug approvals in the U.S. has become so burdensome that many companies conduct clinical trials and commercialize products outside the United States first. We've made it that hard. Another issue is the regulatory and compliance burdens startup companies face, mainly a result of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Like the proposed legislation I mentioned earlier on patents, it's well-intentioned, but it had some dire unintended consequences. And lastly, we're putting up roadblocks where we should be creating incentives for the formation and development of risk capital. About 1 in 10 venture investments is a huge hit if you're doing this well. But some people think that the gains from the 10th one should be taxed like the first 9 never happened and at a much higher tax rate. If that happens, venture capital as we know it is no longer a viable industry, and funding for young companies will dry up. All of these indicators, R&D, education, patents, immigration, tax, and regulatory policy, suggest the U.S. is on a dangerous path. Our approach today favors short-term performance at the expense of long-term progress. We're churning out innovation today, but we're not replenishing the pipeline. This will result in a serious innovation deficit tomorrow, regardless of how quickly or successful other nations appear. It's ironic that we're shifting from the model that fueled our own rise, while other countries are striving to emulate it. You saw earlier China's rapid rise in R&D expenditure and emphasis on instilling historically American traits like entrepreneurialism and creativity in their rising generation. These shifts are part of a sweeping initiative underway in China, as well as other countries from Israel to India to Chile, to import American-style innovation and hopefully spawn the next Silicon Valley. They're focused on cultivating startup clusters, collaboration between universities, industry, and government, and driving venture capital investment. In short, following the American playbook and praying for a Hail Mary pass. So is this new global economy and the rise of the rest a threat to the U.S., or is it an opportunity? It's both. Emerging economies are some of the largest and fastest growing markets in the world. We wouldn't benefit from a poor China. U.S. enterprises need access to a thriving China's market to fuel our own growth. When it comes to the threat, we need to remember that one of our greatest strengths has always been openness, open to people, to ideas, and to collaboration. Edward Teller, the physicist best known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, said, "Our continuing security is acquired by new knowledge rather than by conserving old knowledge. I am certain that this is true." Hoarding knowledge would be neither successful nor sufficient. Yes, we must take adequate steps to keep our borders secure, our people safe, and our technologies in the right hands. But we must also recognize that the more barriers we erect to keep knowledge in, the more people we're keeping out, and that both of these concepts are utterly at odds with our national identity and the values that made this country great. Whether we view China's rise as threat, opportunity, or both, it will happen. China is an ascending global power by any measure. But here are a few of the more interesting ones. In 1987, only a few hundred Chinese held doctorates. By 2006, China graduated 36,000 doctorates. 63% had degrees in science or engineering. You already saw that China doubled its research spending. Much of that is being invested in the US, German, and Japanese research labs. China is now number 2 in the world in publishing scientific articles, up from 17th 20 years ago. The number of Chinese R&D workers doubled between 2000 and 2007, while the US grew by less than 10%. Annual Chinese foreign direct investment flows into the US are rising fast, from less than $1 billion in 2009 to more than $11 billion today. 2 centuries ago, China and India accounted for more than 40% of the world's wealth. It's not a stretch to think they could regain that status. All that said, no ascent was ever smooth. There are fundamental obstacles in its rapid growth. From the vast population and the emerging middle class to critical challenges with its infrastructure, government, and natural resources. Shifting from an economic economy driven by domestic investment and exports to one driven by consumption, technology, and services is a massive change. To top that off, they have a potential credit and real estate crisis looming. The sheer size of China's market is a long-term advantage, but the fact that they had 1 billion people before it began to industrialize is definitely a short-term challenge. A rising middle class means significant growing pains, particularly with the disparity of wealth among Chinese. The country heavily imports resources to fuel its rapid growth and is plagued by a lack of water and critical infrastructure. Northern China accounts for about half of GDP, has 40% of the population and most of the arable land, but only 12% of the rainfall. Widespread pollution of its water supply is also a problem, with a quarter of it unsuitable even for industrial use, and only half of China's population has access to safe drinking water. But the biggest challenge of all may be the body navigating all these obstacles, the government. No large country with a deeply controlling top-down government has ever successfully accomplished a middle-income transition. That does not mean they won't make it happen, and there are several factors in their favor. The Chinese have a much more entrepreneurial society than Russia did, which may be game-changing. At the end of the day, none of this will stop China's ascent. Its transition to global superpower may take longer than many predict, but it will happen. James Wilson, a British professor and expert on China, made a wonderful observation that underscores their sheer tenacity. At the Seoul Olympics in 1988, China ranked 11th for number of gold medals, but just 2 decades later in Beijing, they claimed more than any other nation. If this is what China can achieve in sport, he said, how quickly can it become a leader in science and innovation? With China, the question is not if, but when. Looking at our situation, incumbents rarely win. What goes up comes down. This applies to capital markets, tech companies, and global superpowers, just as the Dutch or the British were once at the top. Ask them. But on those occasions when incumbents do thrive or even win, it's because they had the resolve to harness their strengths and the courage to make tough decisions. China's rise does not signal our demise. It's the challenge, the opportunity, and at the end of the day, it's the reality. We may have some chinks in our armor, many of which I've chronicled here in gory detail, but I'm as confident in American ingenuity as I am certain of Chinese tenacity, and the U.S. still has some important advantages when it comes to innovation. Our innovation ecosystem is the most mature and deeply entrenched of any in the world. The U.S. is home to 150 of the world's top 500 universities and 75% of the top 20. Half of the world's top innovation hubs are U.S. cities. We're agile. We can think on our feet. We know how and when to pick up the slack. For example, as the government and large corporations funnel less into basic R&D, venture capital and smaller private enterprises are putting more energy and investment into early-stage innovation than ever before. And there's a wealth of opportunity on the horizon. Across fields like nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, and space, the next waves of innovation are gathering steam and commanding a growing focus both here and abroad. Nanotechnology is already transforming fields like medicine and construction. Like cloud computing, it has the potential to disrupt a broad range of sectors. It's a highly collaborative field, drawing on many disciplines, and this plays to our strength. And the U.S. is already putting $2 billion a year into nanotechnology research. The big leap will be commercializing these new technologies in coming years. Despite the nascence of private enterprises independently focused on space exploration, it's clearly an area of growing interest and investment. Silicon Valley venture capitalists have already put $1.7 billion into space-related companies this year alone. The field of artificial intelligence was actually launched at a conference here at Dartmouth in 1956. At the time, it was believed that a breakthrough was about 20 years away, and then about every 20 years, the time frame shifted a few decades. Yet there have been groundbreaking recent advances rooted in some early research done in the 1950s. The advances in computing power that I talked about earlier have also played a great role in that progress. The vast computational resources required to recognize a visual or verbal pattern are no longer a barrier. We also understand more about neurology and the combination of analog and digital processes associated with human intelligence. AI will usher in the era of cognitive systems. The future of technology will be about collaboration between humans and machines for better outcomes. And no one is better positioned in this field than we are. So where does that leave us? As I said earlier, America is enjoying the benefits of unprecedented innovation today, and these benefits are likely to produce new jobs, new wealth, and economic growth for years to come, maybe a decade or more. But that advantage is the result of decades of good policy, an unmatched system of primary, secondary, and higher education, and a system of law that protects and defends innovation. No matter what we do, our relative advantage is likely to decrease as other nations rise. But if we take the right steps now, we can continue to be competitive globally and flourish as a nation in the future. The steps we take now are critical. We need policy and priorities at a national level that empower innovation and entrepreneurship. We must reform immigration so that the best talent can and will choose to come to the U.S. For over 50 years, our policies have enabled this and led to exceptional value creation and innovation. We must fix what's broken in our secondary education system, but it's equally important to cultivate the things that are working in the U.S. Innovation has never been about beating the average. It's about being the exception. We must continue to nurture a new generation of creative, collaborative, and curious thinkers. We must implement the right policies to fuel risk capital formation, provide more incentives for R&D with an emphasis on the word R, make our patent system work, and create jobs. We must protect and cultivate the less tangible drivers of U.S. innovation, the cultural systems and the values that are uniquely American and very important to our success in the new global economy. Our spirit of equality, our commitment to empowering and defending individual rights, and our laws designed to enable disruption and prohibit corruption. There are forces at work that will challenge our ability to maintain these pillars, but in the face of these threats, we must choose to be open, not turn inward. Only then can the U.S. play a vital role in shaping, capitalizing on innovation in emerging markets. As the rest rise, we must face them on our own terms and harness our own strengths to thrive in the new global economy. In his memorable book, The Innovators, Walter Isaacson said that innovation will come from people who are able to link beauty to engineering, humanity to technology, and poetry to processors. I believe he's absolutely right. And really, where is there a better place to learn this than at Dartmouth? Thank you.
There's a ton of questions, and it was hard grouping them, but I tried to give different kinds of subjects. The first one has to do with wearables, the famous Apple Watch. It says the Apple Watch represents pretty slick wearables technology, health and wellness apps. How robust is the innovation in this wearables market, and what might we see in the future? And a related question had to do with implants that actually are implanted in your body, again, as a health monitor. And so again, what is the future in the world of implants? So those two.
Well, I think as most of you know, wearables are a sort of hot buzzword in Silicon Valley these days. There's a lot of venture capital funding going into startups of one kind or another. Fitbit just went public, which was a huge success, and so on. And this is all possible, of course, because of the miniaturization of electronics and the fact that they're getting smaller and smaller. And so it's now plausible to put something inside of, that's probably more powerful than a smartphone even 5 years ago in your wristwatch. I think the bigger question, and what we've been thinking about, is how many compelling applications are there for these watches that would cause all of you to want to have one. And prior to the Apple iWatch, I think our view was not so many. And so we passed on a lot of things. And I don't yet own an iWatch. At my now advanced age of 50, I look for things that are very easily visible. But in fact, all my watches of 10 years ago are too small and too hard to read, so I've gotten new watches. My daughters tease me about, why are you always getting new watches, Dad? Well, I can read them. Anyway, the iWatch has caught on, I think, with a lot of success, and some of the people I know who have them do find real value in being able to link, what's happening on your smartphone to your watch and be able to get a message or have it vibrate when you have a new message of one kind or another. So I think they're likely to be, something that's very popular in the next few years. As it relates to implantable technology, of which there are many kinds already, for keeping track of your heart and things like that. I think that's another very interesting field. We have one company that we invested in, I want to say 18 years ago. This is what it's like to invest in medical technology. It's now called Senseonics, if memory serves me correctly. And my partner, Jim Barrett, was the initial founding CEO of this company. The idea behind it is to have something about the size of a grain of rice under the skin of your arm, which can monitor your glucose. And then you have a watch-like thing that you wear just on top of it, and the watch subcutaneously can read out whatever's in the little rice-sized sensor. That technology has taken, I want to say, 18 years to get right. It's finally working and working well, which is super exciting because for diabetes patients, it's totally game-changing. If you just think about the challenge of monitoring your insulin, if every time to do it you have to prick your finger, you're just not going to get accurate readings. And so I think there will be some really, really significant medical benefits that come from some of these implantable devices.
Good. There were a number of questions on the subject of immigration. And if you were here for Matthew Slaughter's address, the dean of Tuck School, you remember he mentioned this same problem. One of the best students at Tuck this year graduating came into his office in tears because he's a foreign student and he had not been in the lottery to get a H-1B visa. And he was furthermore told that he has to get out of the country in 60 days. That was the time he was told. And I did a little research since then, and I learned that last year there were 250,000 applications for 85,000 positions and visas. The rest of the people were basically told that they had to leave. So the questions that you've raised had to do with mainly what are you doing, or is your industry doing, with Congress to get some of these laws changed so that we can tap into this fertile talent pool?
Well, John, as you know, I've been very involved in the patent reform legislation the last few months. And that's legislation which we can talk about if you want, but there are people who on both sides disagree about what to do, which I think is understandable. But when it comes to immigration reform, there is no one in Silicon Valley who is not very strongly in favor of immigration reform that would bring highly talented people into the country. It's unfortunately been caught up with a political tussle between the Republicans and Democrats, both of whom agree that the policy of, say, stapling a green card to the back of any reasonable diploma would be a good idea, creating visas for people who come here to start companies and are able to attract funding for them, that sort of thing. Everybody on both sides of the aisle agrees with that. The problem is that the Democrats, of which I am one, I'm a moderate Democrat, if that helps you in calibrating my remarks at all, but the Democrats would like to couple that kind of immigration with more comprehensive immigration reform, and are only willing to move forward with the former if they get the latter. And the Republicans say, no, we don't agree with what you want to do over there, so we just want to focus on this. And that has created a stalemate for at least 5 years.
Wow. There's other questions which really have to do with the business that he's in which one question said, you often must see companies with no revenue or profit record, inventors or innovators with absolutely no business experience. What are you looking for? And a corollary question is, what motivates innovators? Is it the money? Is it the fame? Is it creating just curiosity? So,
well, let's start with that, John, because actually I think that's really important in terms of evaluating entrepreneurs or prospective entrepreneurs. Our experience is the entrepreneurs who are in it for the money are not the ones who are going to succeed. The ones that are going to succeed are the ones who are in it because they have an insight and a real passion for starting a company and making something of it. And that's important because if they don't have that passion, they're not going to make it. Starting a company is just way too hard. And so we look for people who have a track record of success in their life, no matter where they came from. It's not necessarily about degrees or many of the formulaic ways in which resumes are evaluated. And I generally speaking only ask one question in interviews. I just ask people, how did you get to this room on this day? You know, what happened to you along the way that made you who you are? And tell me where you want to go in the next 10 years. And then I leave them an hour to answer the question. And having done that thousands of times now, I can tell you that it becomes readily apparent who is on a path to really changing the world.
Okay, and then what you look for, that's the kind of thing you're looking
That's what we
deeper.
look for in terms of entrepreneurs. In terms of companies themselves and technologies, you know, for better or worse in our business, we're a very large firm. Our funds are $2.5 billion in size, and consequently, and we have a limited number of people, so we invested in about 100 companies in a given fund, and necessarily we need to have some really big outcomes to make those funds work. So we are strongly biased towards investing in things which can be really big. That's not to say that there aren't lots and lots of really attractive opportunities for investment and company formation that just don't fit that model. So in terms of what we look for, I always start with, you know, is this something that can be really, can I imagine this being a multi-billion-dollar revenue enterprise? And if the answer to that is yes, then we keep exploring and trying to understand whether what they have is actually able to change the game that they're looking to change. And to me, the single most important thing to think about is simply the value proposition. What does this new product or service do for the user? Is it so compelling that there are just no chances that they won't want to try it? Or is it kind of a nice to have? Because if it's a nice to have, the risk of trying something new isn't compelling. But if it's going to change your life, you're going to put up with a lot of the foibles that are always a part of new products and inventions.
We have obviously a group that is interested in investing because a number of questions said, how can I invest in all this potential profit for my grandchildren? And are there or should there be venture capital funds that invest in the areas you describe that I'd like to invest in?
Well, investing directly in venture capital firms is not an easy thing to do, unfortunately, from an individual standpoint. simply because the venture firms themselves raise funds every 3 years, and they want to have a relatively small number of people to deal with as investors. So in our case, there are maybe 100 to 200 investors, and they're institutional. Some of them very large, and that's just easier to manage because they write a $100 million check or a $200 million check, and we can count on them to do that, every 3 years because it's part of a $100 billion portfolio or something. So it's a little bit difficult. I mentioned a little bit earlier in my talk angel list, Naval Ravikant's thing. There is now a significant movement to make it possible for individuals to invest directly in startups through various mechanisms like that, and I think that's something worth exploring. We'll see if we get automated like everybody else.
Apparently, a number of you subscribe to The Economist magazine because you referred to The Economist in the current edition that apparently says that the patent system and the regulatory environment globally are blocks to innovation. Do you agree, and is it politically feasible to reform these impediments? And the corollary question was the rise of the patent trolls and the junk patents and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of legitimate concerns about the state of the patent system today, including some of the behavior of patent trolls. But there are the part of the premise of the Economist piece is questioning whether having any kind of system to protect ideas and intellectual property is worthwhile at all. And I think that's a crazy idea. And I would just reference that 40% or 1/3 of our economy is patent dependent, and 40 million American jobs, and we've done better as an economy than anybody else in the last 100 years by any measure. And without it, I don't think we would have. So I'd be a little careful about the idea of throwing out the patent system. And unfortunately, that's about the net effect of what the current legislation would do. There are two bills in the House. There's a bill in the House, a bill in the Senate, H.R. 9 in the House and S. 1137 in the Senate, which would, each of which in subtle ways would essentially eliminate the patent system. From the standpoint of somebody who files a patent, is granted a patent and would like to be able to protect their intellectual property. And they do this essentially by making it so costly and so time-consuming to defend your patent that you would never actually do it. These bills are being sponsored by very large companies. Google and Cisco are the primary ones, Microsoft, Intel, lots of companies. And these companies actually would rather just not have patents because their advantages in the world are well established, and they're threatened by the next set of startup companies. And so to make it very hard for those small companies to defend themselves is a much more attractive thing to do. They also spend hundreds of millions or billions of dollars a year in licensing fees that would be less, it would be less costly if you didn't have to do that. But the problem is that these bills have been marketed in the name of stopping patent trolls, and they've been marketed very effectively to everyone in Washington, so much so that my Washington-based colleagues tell me that if you land at Reagan International Airport, there are literally billboards about stopping patent trolls. And so let's talk about patent trolls for a second. Patent trolls, for those of you who are not familiar with them, is a term used to describe what are otherwise known as non-practicing entities. These are corporations set up not to operate any individual business, but merely to buy and sell patents, patents that were applied for by the inventors, but then at some point they're no longer using them, so they can sell them to a non-practicing entity who will then in turn go around to all the people who are infringing on that patent and either collect royalties from them directly or sue them if they don't want to pay royalties. And personally, I don't think that's an illegitimate thing to do, but the tactics that some of these organizations use are in many cases very problematic. So for example, they will they will send demand letters to retailers who are selling, let's just say, computer printers that violate somebody's patent. And they will say, you have to cease and desist from what you're doing because you're abusing my patent. And the retailers look at them, well, what is this all about? I have no idea. So there are various things that they do which are problematic. Another one is frivolous lawsuits. So one of the problems with the patent system is that there are, in fact, a lot of patents that have been granted that probably shouldn't have been granted. They weren't really fundamental breakthrough stuff. But nevertheless, some of these patent trolls will buy these relatively invaluable patents, and they'll sue people anyway, hoping that someone will settle instead of going to court. And so in that way, these frivolous lawsuits are, I think, a negative aspect of what's happening today. But there are also ways to deal with that, and it's worth noting that, so one of the provisions of the bill, this is probably more than most people wanted to hear about, but one of the provisions of these bills is fee shifting, mandatory fee shifting, so that the loser in any lawsuit will always pay, thereby sort of doubling the cost and maybe creating an incentive not to put forward a frivolous lawsuit. That makes sense between two well-funded entities. It's sort of logical that that would be the outcome. But between a really small company and a really big company, it becomes a club for the big company to squash the small company. So that's the first thing to consider. But the second thing to consider is that the person who's best equipped to judge whether a lawsuit is in fact frivolous is probably the judge, who can see all the facts. And so just having them be completely prescribed by law that there's always fee shifting to the loser is probably not the best way. And in fact, the Supreme Court has had 2 cases in the last 2 years which have basically set precedent for judges to do just that. And since those cases have been ruled on, the number of frivolous lawsuits has declined precipitously. Ooh. So we don't need necessarily a new law to stop that particular behavior.
Good. This is a question on employment law policy, and it reads, does not the emergence of Uber suggest employment law should shift towards modular, flexible, contractor-like, and away from the old lifetime employment corporate model?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, John. We are investors in several sharing economy companies, including Uber and another one called Hello Alfred. And Uber, as you know, basically has contract workers who file 1099 tax forms, whereas Alfred has chosen to employ people 100% of the time, and there's a kind of continuum between them. I think, given the amount of noise that I hear about this, it seems to me that there's probably some clarification needed to create more flexible structures both for employees and employers.
Good. Here's a question that has to do with President Obama touted a company called Solyndra 5 years ago as a prime example of American solar energy innovation and leadership. Then the Chinese solar companies swooped in and took over the US market. Within a year, Solyndra went bankrupt. Did the Chinese have superior technology or simply lower prices? And the corollary question is, what's the future? What interesting developments are going on in the solar industry?
How many days do you have to talk about this topic? Unfortunately, I had a front row seat at what happened to the US solar industry. I helped to start our alternative investing practice in 2002. We went on to invest in 35 companies, about $500 million, on top of which other investors invested another $2 billion. So about $2.5 billion of capital. And of the 35, probably 3 or 4 are alive today. One has worked out well, O-Power, which is a publicly traded company, and most of the rest have gone out of business. It was not a fun exercise, and the saddest part of the story is that many of them had by far and clearly the best technology. There was not enough of a market for it here. There were not, these technologies needed initially some advantage that they didn't from a market standpoint. So for example, remember we talked about the government as the biggest customer of semiconductors. Well, if the government had bought a lot of solar technology from US startups, we'd probably have a solar industry today. But as a consequence of, and I'll come back to Solyndra because it's important, as a consequence to how this played out, basically there wasn't enough of a market, so all the companies eventually couldn't raise any more money, so they were eventually going out of business. Meanwhile, the Chinese saw this wonderful intellectual property, remember patents, came in and bought up all the IP for nothing. Now, there's a second part of the story, which is what happened in China. In China, as most of you know, the country is internally extremely competitive. And so there were initially some successful Chinese solar companies, and every provincial governor and every city mayor decided that they wanted one too. And so they would raise capital to build their own solar plant. And pretty soon, after better part of a decade, there was something like 20 times the world demand of capacity. So there was a massive oversupply problem. And of course, when that happens, prices plummet. And that's really that's the second piece of what killed the US market. But the result is, and that of course led to tremendous turmoil in the Chinese market. But there were survivors, and some of those survivors will be the world leaders of tomorrow, who now have all the intellectual property that we invented in their hands.
Solyndra, you're going to...
So what happened with Solyndra, the government, the energy department loaned some sizable amount of money to Solyndra. This is a company we actually looked at twice and passed on. And there were lots of very, very credible people involved in it. But we passed on it because we didn't think the technology would work. I mean, it was fundamentally not going to work. So, but nevertheless, hundreds of millions of dollars went into it, and ultimately it failed. And when it failed, it was used as a criticism of the administration and their use of taxpayer money to lend money to these startups. The consequence of that was that they, of course, they not only stopped lending money to any other company, they pulled all the loans of the existing companies, one of which was one of my portfolio companies called Fisker Automotive, which was a competitor to Tesla and was on the verge of commercializing what I think would have been an extremely successful launch. And it's a long and terrible story, but ultimately the loss of that funding killed the company. And now we have only one electric car company instead of two.
And I remember that an investor in the BD, whatever that company, the Chinese electric car company, one of the major investors, Warren Buffett.
Bird, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Burke?
The Chinese company is called Bird.
Okay, and it's Warren
And that's
Buffett,
what Warren
who's, and
invested
they
in.
tried to buy Warren's stake back recently, and he said, no way, I'm going to continue investing in this. Two questions having to do with kind of the rural and developing countries in the world. On a recent visit to China, we saw thousands of solar panels on the rooftops of huts in rural villages. It turned out when we asked our guide that these were solar water heaters. And people could, for the first time in rural China, as well as the cities, get hot water. Is this an area for high potential use throughout the third world at no damage to the climate? And the follow-up is, is clean energy giving the third world tools to finally provide energy but not create pollution and all that?
So the answer to the first part of the question is there are some really wonderful technologies like the solar heaters you're talking about, which have become cost effective enough to be useful in parts of the world like China, rural China. And of course, most of those parts of the world don't have a grid. And so it's actually possible for something to become useful at a cost point that wouldn't necessarily make sense here. It makes sense where you're connected to the grid. But the challenge for most of these technologies is to be able to get enough volume to drive down the cost curve to the point where they're affordable. So with the exception of some things like that, I think most of them are unlikely to be of great value to the third world unless they've already succeeded at being of significant value to the first world.
A question on wind power. It seems that the use of wind power in America gets bogged down by protests against the sight of large wind turbines on ridgetops or along bodies of water. Are we lagging the rest of the world in the use of wind power?
Yes. This is another one of those sad stories, which we had front row seat at. But the long and the short of it is that China in particular has taken over the wind industry. And it's because they behaved very similar to the way our government did, 80 years ago or so when we were funding, having the defense industries buy up all these technologies. They created a market for things. The government said they would buy solar panels, wind panels, by creating a market and creating lots of cheap funding, they end up owning the market when the cost curves come down, and of course they have the manufacturing prowess to do it well.
Here's a question about thorium. Thorium is regarded as a cleaner, safer nuclear power and in more plentiful supply and so forth. Do you see it as a promising alternative energy source, and what is holding it back?
I know nothing about thorium.
Thorium, okay. But it's a uranium...
Joe, what do we know about thorium? No?
Maybe that's thorium's problem. We don't know anything about it. There's some questions about Stanford and the West Coast. Why is Stanford an incubator of innovative companies to agree that Harvard and MIT are not? What can Harvard and MIT and Dartmouth learn from Stanford?
Well, some of it is a historical accident. I mean, once Silicon Valley kind of got going, it was things built one on the other. And I think it's worth mentioning that as much credit as Stanford gets, Berkeley should get just about as much. Berkeley has been an unbelievable source of innovation as well. But I think among the things Stanford does well that you don't see as much in Eastern universities are encouraging faculty members to start companies. They have a very generous sabbatical program. They have relatively friendly policies for licensing intellectual property developed and funded by the university and oftentimes by government grants, so that professors have little friction between what they do inside the university and then going off and starting a company with relatively lightweight terms of payments back to the university. And then having enough time to actually get the company off the ground without having to give up their academic positions. The two Coursera founders have just gone through this process. One ultimately did give up her tenured position to stay with the company, and the other one went back and is still a faculty member.
Here's a very practical question. With all the brain power of Silicon Valley headquartered in that one spot, why did you locate it on top of the Andreas Fault, and what is the backup plan?
Remember I said it was a historical accident? We actually live about 400 yards from the San Andreas Fault in a town called Portola Valley, which has the interesting distinction. It's a town of about 4,000 people, essentially due west of the Stanford campus. And it has the interesting distinction of being the highest creator of patents per capita of any zip code in the United States. So it's chock full of entrepreneurs and Stanford professors and the like. And they've all chosen to live right on the San Andreas Fault. So I don't know what that says.
There's no backup plan, no.
No, there's no backup plan.
20 years ago, Japan was the perceived tech leader, or at least one of the best. What happened to it, and any parallels to what they are doing now and what China is doing?
What Japan is doing now?
Yeah. Are they still a leader in innovation?
They're very good in some areas, but they have been relatively unsuccessful at new innovations that lead to breakthrough company formation. I mean, it's not a particularly entrepreneurial society from what we can tell. There's very little venture capital that goes into Japan, for example. But their manufacturing prowess is still phenomenal. Their ability to take somebody else's innovations and hone them down and make something, really great, and the quality of the products, as we all know, is second to none. So, Japan is an amazing place.
And then someone asked the question, what about India? We haven't had really much discussion about India and innovation.
Yeah, India is a really important question for me personally. We've had an investing practice in India since about 2005, I think, and have a couple of $100 million invested there in a collection of companies and a team on the ground and all the rest. It's been a harder place, believe it or not, than China, despite the fact that it's a democratic country and they have had stock markets, freely tradable stock markets, and all these things that we would, if you just put a checklist of things that you cared about as an investment destination, that India would stack up pretty well. And I think over the long run, India may do extremely well, but it's been historically really, really inhibited by the corrupt practices of the government, which have made it very hard for startups. Its lack of infrastructure is kind of breathtaking for those who haven't traveled there, as compared to China, which with its top-down investment strategy has been able to build, first-class highways and cell phone towers and everything else.
High-speed rail.
Not to mention five-star hotels and wonderful restaurants and whatnot. So they're kind of a tale of two cities, or two countries anyway. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out over the next couple of decades. But my personal view is that, especially with Modi, the new prime minister, taking a sort of business-first approach, and changing some policies that needed to be changed, I think they're on a good course.
There were some questions having to do with cybersecurity and cyber attacks by other countries, possibly Russia, China, getting some of our secrets, some of our information that we've worked hard to develop, and being able to use them immediately, legitimately or not. And the question had to do with how can we protect our innovations and make our companies succeed, and is there any progress going on now that we're in more dialogue with countries like China of getting rid of some of this cyber espionage?
I don't think this is going to stop. This is a very important area of concern to me. We're kind of on the front lines of it in many ways, because we've invested in a lot of companies that are developing technologies, mostly on the defense, well, actually exclusively on the defensive side of this game. But sovereign governments have figured out that, you can't really be fingerprinted too well based on the attacks that you make, and you can create a huge amount of damage without ever launching a missile, and you can steal an awful lot of intellectual property without ever funding R&D. So there are way more benefits to this kind of activity than there are costs. And so I think we will see nothing but an escalating arms race of so-called cyber terrorism. And not surprisingly, that has created an industry for people who are trying to prevent better defensive mechanisms. And we funded a bunch of them.
Someone said they heard about Silicon Beach. What is your feeling on this? Do you ever heard of Silicon Beach?
Well, I haven't heard of Silicon Beach, John.
Okay, well, whoever asked the question did. We'll find out. Let's see. What do you think of the movement to do away with tenure in education and making our future teachers have degrees in history, math, etc., instead of in education?
Well, let's talk about tenure first. I actually am a fan of tenure from the standpoint of giving people the freedom to do the kinds of basic research without any purposeful intent at the beginning. As we talked about earlier, it's led to most of the important discoveries and ultimate commercialization of things. So I like the idea of tenure. My father was dean of the Mass Maritime Academy for a few years, and they in addition to tenure had a union, which was a pretty toxic combination. You can talk to him about that afterwards. So I think tenure alone is fine. Unionized faculty I would not find to be a very sensible idea. And importantly, in secondary schools, I think it's where research is not being conducted. I think it's a travesty that we don't have a more competitive labor environment for teachers.
There's a question you raised in your slide about basic research versus applied, or basic patents versus applied patents. And in China, you mentioned they're spending a lot more in R&D. Are we seeing a lot more basic patents being issued to the Chinese versus most other countries in the world?
Well, they're issuing patents like crazy. I don't have a view as to how good their patents are, but I think there's some evidence that they're not that good. But as I said, I think sooner or later they'll get to be very good. It's just a question of when.
People all heard about the devaluation of the yuan by 2% a couple of days ago. Will that have any impact, in your view, on American business or on innovation at all? Or just simply make them more competitive?
I mean, I think it's just more evidence that the Chinese government is concerned about the slowing of their economy, and it's a lever that they have that our government doesn't have, because our currency trades freely against other currencies. But we shouldn't forget that our government has also exercised an incredibly powerful lever that no one else has, which is to print money through quantitative easing over the last however many years. And so you have these two, very powerful governments with lots of big levers that nobody else in the world has. And when they see cause for concern about their own economy, they use them. We can all debate whether it's good or bad. But in terms of the near-term impact, obviously, by devaluing their currency, they make their exports more attractive to the rest of the world. So their economy should be stimulated by that. It makes it more expensive for us to buy Chinese things, so that may have some damping effect on our economy. But 2%, I don't think this is a big deal.
Some people were really curious about Little Israel, and it showed up on your slide as a kind of an R&D play. How'd that happen, and what's going on there?
Israel's an unbelievable nation. I mean, they have virtually no market to themselves, and yet they produce incredible amounts of innovation. Much of it comes to Silicon Valley. They've actually, I alluded to the fact that everybody comes to Silicon Valley to try to figure out how to have one of their own. I would say Israel has done this as well or better than anybody else. And what they've figured out is a kind of hub and spoke model works really well. They create the R&D and they keep the jobs associated with it in Israel, and then they send their entrepreneurs to Silicon Valley when they're ready to commercialize something. They raise venture capital in the Valley. They oftentimes hire professional management in the Valley, and then all the business functions of the company end up being in the Valley, and the first market they pursue is usually the United States.
Here's one of wanting to know a little bit about your role with Thayer School of Engineering, and it is, as a member of the Board of Overseers for Thayer, what role do you play, and how much are you involved, and what impact do you have on the engineering program or curriculum at Thayer?
Well, like I think a board member of any organization, we basically try to advise the CEO, in this case it's Joe Helbley, and give him ideas that we pick up from the various things that we do in our day-to-day life, and he of course is smart enough to disregard the ones that don't make any sense, and that's probably most of them. And then we also get to see the amazing things that are happening at their school today. It's really remarkable and very, very exciting.
There's a question regarding the battle of the giants, the Amazon, Apple, Google, Samsung, and Microsoft, and how they each seem to be encroaching on each other's space, and they're competing at a very high level. And the question is, do you see this ending up with one or two of these really having the commanding share of this market, or is there a lot to go around?
Well, it depends which market you're talking about. In the case of the search market, Google has very commanding market share in the United States, something like 80 or 90%, and even more so in Europe. They obviously are not in China. Baidu dominates that market since they left a few years ago. If you're talking about cell phones, Apple, while making a relatively small fraction of the actual handsets themselves, takes away the lion's share of the profits of the entire industry. So you could argue that the consolidation of power is already taken place in those businesses.
Google acquired Nest, the maker of the smart thermostat for the home and now other internet-connected gadgets for the home. Is this likely to become the wave of the future or a passing fancy?
Well, I think the simple way to think about it is the technology to create things like Nest is now available. It's cost effective. You can connect things wirelessly. You can have fairly strong amounts of computational power for a couple of dollars that you could stick into a device that you would attach to anything. So that's not, to me, the interesting question. The interesting question is, what do you do with it? And is it of value to do that? So to the extent that a Nest device delivers, back to my earlier thought, a value proposition to consumers that they find meaningful, then Nests will proliferate. Somebody gave me a Nest. I've never really used it, so I haven't been personally compelled by it yet. But to the extent that it really does allow you to save energy by dampening down or raising the temperature of your home and things of that nature, I think those kinds of things will definitely grow grow and become very popular. Importantly, I think these things have to be easy to use. That's one of the biggest, trends in Silicon Valley, is that as more and more of these technologies are tried out on consumers first, the companies that are successful are the ones that have made technology really easy to use. And that has created, by the way, for those of you who are still here at Dartmouth as a student, huge shortfall in people who are specializing in what's called UI or UX, which is user interface design and design functionality. So these are, I personally think that as technology is, the building blocks of technology are cheaper and available to just about anyone. The thing that matters most is figuring out what to do with it and being able to design it and package it in a product that is easy for anyone.
A couple of people want to know why, if this is factual, but why there are so few women in Silicon Valley. Is that true? And could it hamper innovation?
Well, could it hamper innovation? Of course. I mean, how can you expect to have the best result if half the people aren't in the race? And I think it will also be resolved. I think this is a temporal problem in the sense that Silicon Valley has largely been built by engineers, and there haven't historically been as many female engineers as there have been male engineers. But it's an important discrepancy, and I was recently chairman of the National Venture Capital Association and helped to start a diversity task force to figure out how, if we focus on it, we can accelerate the progress not just of women, but all underrepresented minorities in Silicon Valley companies, but also in the venture capital industry, which has a diversity quotient that's relatively pathetic.
What percent, people are just eager to know that when you put your bets down on all those different companies, what percent of your investments in emerging technologies and companies bear fruition, either by going public or being sold? What's kind of a rough idea?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about 1 in 10 is the company that makes your portfolio, and that's true. A more careful look at the numbers would say that somewhere between 25 and 35% of the companies that we fund, or any venture capital firm funds, go out of business and you lose all your money. Another 35% or something like that make a modest profit. And then the top 20% produce most of the returns, and a small number of them produce probably half of the total return.
Wow. There's questions having to do with our divided and sometimes cantankerous U.S. Congress, and not just in some of the subjects we've talked about, but do you have any suggestions for any lobbying that goes on that could help in whether it's clean energy or it's other technology initiatives that seem sometimes to be stymied? I mean, they even get into high-speed rail, in this country. It seems like people are against it, and there's no money at the state level, and I don't know, but the questions have to do really with the role of government and how to change that so they become a sponsor of rather than a budget limitator.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I'm leery of government getting into our industries. On the other hand, as we've noted, from a historical perspective, they've played quite an important role. And so it's something to consider with trepidation. On the other hand, there are certain policy issues that would make a tremendous difference. Again, immigration reform, high-tech immigration would be number 1, 2, and 3 on the list. This, of course, is a policy that costs nothing. Every H-1B grantee is employed by a company that on average goes on to employ 5 more people if it's a sizable company and 8 more people if it's a small company. So these are not people coming into our country taking anyone else's jobs. They're coming in and creating jobs for other people. So we absolutely need this kind of reform. From a longer term, and by the way, it has the wonderful benefit of being able to fix demographics. We can't have demographics changed any other way than immigration. And so to the extent that we have shortfalls of any kind in our society, we can let people in which fill those shortfalls. From a longer term perspective, I see research investment is critical. So we talked about that earlier.
Yeah. Talking about climate change again, and this just has to do with whether you see clean energy steadily improving that. We've got still China puffing out coal and all, yet they're leading the clean energy sector with some of their companies. How do you see the increasing use of clean energy? To what extent in the next 10 or 15 years, and will that have a big effect on the climate that we are now facing?
I don't study this carefully, John. I think at a high level, it's pretty clear that no matter how quickly we're able to develop any of these alternative energies and scale up production of them, the amount of alternative energy that would then produce electricity is still going to be a very small fraction of worldwide demand. So I don't think that's necessarily going to change, the equation for the climate.
And I guess the other final question I'd like to have asked, if one person put it in a card, and that is, as you look at American power in the world, and innovation is a part of that, as is military and financial and other subjects we've covered. Do you see that you've raised some questions, but you see overall that we still have the opportunity to remain dominant in that field, or do you see that that's absolutely difficult?
I don't think we'll be dominant, but I think we could be very important if we get it right.
Mm-hmm. If we get it right.
If we get it right.
Okay, I want to just say thank you to Scott Sandell.